Good morning, everyone. Very happy to be here with you. I hope you have your cup of tea or coffee. I have my tea here. Very nice to be here again. Maybe some of you are already familiar with this session that we have, this series that we have started a few weeks ago. And for the new ones, well, welcome to here. So we are in Coffee in Good Company, which is a webinar series that have been created by BLab Europe to talk about the topics of stakeholder governance. And what we try to do is really to understand what does it mean for a company, a business to play a positive role in society by acting for the benefits of its stakeholder, meaning the people and the planet. Since there have been so many talks around that topic recently, talking a lot about indeed what should be the role of business in society and how do we consider those stakeholders. But it's not always indeed easy to understand what does it mean to be all interdependent and how do we act and include those stakeholders to act for their benefits. So today is the 4th edition. We had already the pleasure of having representative of B Corps, those companies that got certified because they really do include the interest of all the stakeholders into their governance model. And today we're really happy to have another really great emblematic B Corp representative with Triodos Bank, which is, for those that are familiar with the B Corp community, one of the most really powerful in terms of impacts. They're really always overrated, best for the score in the impact improvement and scoring system that we have, and have been operating for now almost 40 years to change the financial system. I'm here today with Peter Blom, who has been contributing to Triodos Bank to build that institution for 41 years, which I hope you can join me in congratulating him for really making this huge contribution. And I will let him present himself and Triodos, which has been what Peter told me indeed, elected as the most sustainable finance bank in 2009 by the Financial Times. So quite happy and humbly proud of having you, Peter, with us in this conversation. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Maybe, Peter, can you start this little conversation by explaining for those that are here with us just a short description of Triodos and the role that you've played in Triodos in the past year?
Yeah, to make it very short, because 41 years is quite a long period where a lot of development took place. But the bank was founded in 1980 to really show that dealing consciously with money can really affect change. And I think that was very new in 1980, that banks actually could contribute to that notion that people wanted to change the world, also through directing their money in a more conscious way. So we started as a very small bank, only 5 people. Then you could start still a bank with 5 people, and I was one of them. I was sort of responsible for the loan department, as it was called at the time. And we were focusing on projects, businesses, initiatives that were striving for social renewal and actually were not able to get a loan from a mainstream bank. So in that sense, it was quite new and unexpected. Today, the bank is from 5 co-workers, we grew to more than 1,500. We are now in 5 countries in Europe. And we have sort of total assets under management, always important for a bank, of about 22 billion euro. So in that sense, we have come a long way. And but it's not only the numbers that count, it's particularly also that we also not wanted to finance change, as we call it. So all the projects but also change finance, changing the system. And particularly since the financial crisis, we have been very active in that field through the Sustainable Finance Lab, through the Global Alliance for Banking on Values, through the Club of Rome. So there are quite a few sort of ways we cooperated with others to try to change the financial system. And I think we have come a long way. It's not near as what it should be, but we really made important steps. So that's basically the history and the purpose of Triodos.
Thank you, Peter. And we can feel the passion in the way that you describe and the pride on the description of the bank itself. And that's really interesting to see that the bank is itself both an advocate to change the system, to go out of its original scope, to really change the overall system in which it's operating with this purpose and mission at the core of the company itself, but also in the way the company operates. And since today we're talking about stakeholder governance, maybe that would be interesting for people here to understand how does Triodos operates and what is it actually, how do you define a stakeholder, especially for a bank, and how do you integrate those stakeholders, how do you manage them and integrate them into your governance?
Yeah, particularly for a bank, it's pretty obvious that you are a stakeholder organization. I think when banks started to say they are just normal businesses working for the shareholders, I think they did really not understood what a bank is about. A bank is about connecting depositors and borrowers to make sure that deposited money is used in a good way in the economy. Of course, there are also shareholders who enable the bank to do the business they do by creating this capital buffer every bank needs. But the bank is also a reflection of the broader development in society. And I think that broader, almost general interest banks are representing has becoming much more into the conscious today, where in this sort of 10, 20 years ago, it became really also only making money with money. So in that sense, stakeholders should be obvious for banks, and they're becoming more obvious again. For Triodos, the stakeholder model was that we were creating the governance form where not only the interest of the shareholders were represented, but also of the customers and also of the co-workers, the continuity of the bank and the mission of the bank. So the shareholder who is in one foundation, and they issue depository receipts to finance their share capital, their 100% ownership of the shares in the company. They have this multi-perspective on the interest. So it is about the continuity, it is about the mission, it is also about the return for the shareholders, but not, it doesn't start with that. It's an equal interest. So in that sense, stakeholder has for Triodos always been a very natural approach. Today, it's more sort of defined how we do it. We describing in our annual report, there are actually 3 types of stakeholders. There are sort of the economic stakeholders, everybody who earns or money from the fact that they deal with us, having a salary, having a loan, having a return. All those economic interests is a group we see as one aspect. Then there is this much broader stakeholder group that are more the NGOs in society who are interested in what does the bank do for society at large. And we have to find a 3rd group of stakeholders that are the people who help us to think forward. So the great minds of this world, and how can they help us to see what is coming from the future towards us? How can they help us to anticipate what is needed from a bank, from the financial sector? And that is more the strengths of the IDs, the strengths of, and that's also a stakeholder, a quite important stakeholder. So we feel those 3 groups are quite important to us. They are defined in our annual report. Every year we describe a little bit what we have done on these 3 groups and how do they interact. So stakeholder has been at the heart of the bank, but has developed over time in a more developed system of how to organize it, and I think should be developed more into the future.
But it's really interesting to see that indeed that stakeholder have become such an important part. So it's not just like the bank and its stakeholder, but it seems integrated, right, from what I hear about you. And also very reminding also the people hearing with, today this conversation that they also can take part of it by asking questions. So please, if you have any questions, I know Peter would be very keen on answering them because again, he's so passionate about that topic. Do not hesitate to add them in the chat, and we'll leave some space at the end to answer them. But to come back in that stakeholder, indeed, governance itself, so you explained the segmentation, and that's really interesting to see that depending on how the stakeholder is involved with Triodos, and you also interact with them in a different way because they don't bring the same thing or are not being consulted in the same way, but would also be interested in how you create conversations and bring them to the boards in the decision making. And do you interact with them independently, one group by another, or do you organize more transversal instances? Maybe just a little bit on that.
Yeah, in our annual report, you will find what we call the materiality matrix, what is sort of comparing the view of the management of the bank and the view of the stakeholders and how they match. It's quite an important tool for making more concrete if there is a real difference. There can be a difference between the bank and the stakeholders, but it's important to know where that difference is and how we are working on it. And maybe we have to adjust even our policies because certain stakeholders feel we should do more this or less this. So that's quite important. We do not want to separate the groups because we feel that the conversation between the stakeholder groups, and that's a very important point, I think, for the future, for all stakeholder organizations, you have to make it a group discussion. It cannot be a bilateral discussion between the company and each stakeholder. That puts the company too much in the center. And I think it's much more interesting to see what stakeholders like to ask or tell each other. And the company becomes not sort of in a sort of bipolar situation with each stakeholder. So that's an interesting aspect. And we have, every year we have a meeting with stakeholders from the different groups. And there are topics they choose, and we will discuss a full day with them, the topics they want to bring to the table and give recommendations, advice, and we sort of reflect it in our annual report and we use it in our strategy.
And then a question that comes to my mind when we talk about stakeholder and bringing their voice into indeed the board, I'm wondering and curious to know, how do you bring the voice of a stakeholder that doesn't have such an explicit voice, which is the environment itself? How do you consider that as special stakeholder, which is indeed also a stakeholder in the system in which we're operating?
Well, I think it's interesting that it is that is why this category of the NGOs, the second one and the third one, people with great ideas, are so important. It's not only the economic interest, the short-term economic interest is also a reality, and we do address them, but there is also these other groups, and they are part of this discussion and bring in much more this notion of, well, there are sort of representation of the planet, so to speak, or about other people who could not participate from a social perspective. So I feel you cannot have everybody around the table from the planet. That's too complicated, but you can have really a group of people who do represent these different aspects of stakeholders. So I think that's quite important.
And you said a really important word with, as you said, representativity, so that we make sure that the decisions are being made, taking into account indeed those different interests by hearing those voices and not just thinking what should be best for this type of category of stakeholders. And it's so interesting to see that you're shifting the perspective of a company, as you said, not at the center, but more as a facilitation and a connector, as a system itself, which is not something that we usually think about when we think about a company. We think in silo and we think of independent entities, but your vision is much more integrated. And I can feel in the way you talk this interdependence and how it's all linked as if it was so natural. That's really interesting to see in that way.
No, but for example, when we have these discussions with these stakeholders, it's a group of about 50 people. You cannot have too many because then there is not a real discussion. But that's, you can really see that the pricing of the company and the additional activities the bank wants to do, where they need resources for, the level of salaries, all those things are in the room, and people start to understand that it's not a simple thing, I want this, please bank do this, but at what cost, and what does it bring short term, what does it bring longer term? So the whole thinking of the stakeholders, and people are really interested in that, is my experience, it becomes more real. It's not like I want something for me and just do that. It's something, if I want something, it's probably going at the cost of some of the other stakeholders. And how do we deal with that? And I think this is typically also for today. I mentioned it in one of the television programs, also for Shell. Shell has this court case now that they have to comply more with the Paris Agreement, and I feel it's not something what you should do in court in the end, and they appeal, but you should invite your stakeholders and say, well, dear stakeholders, you are us and we are you. How are we going to make more progress? And what does it mean for the consumer? What does it mean for the planet? What does it mean for the shareholder? And then you get a completely different conversation, I feel. What is not happening enough yet. In smaller companies, it is middle-sized. In the big companies, this is really the big challenge, I feel.
And that brings me to one of the questions that is being asked in the chat to understand. So Triodos is the perfect example that you're showing that this alternative way of governing and in the interest of stakeholders is actually possible, especially for a bank. So you're leading by example, and the success that Triodos has seen is just already like talking by itself that it is not only possible, but it's also possible to thrive in that way. And the question in the chat is to understand why do you think there haven't been since so many other companies and many other banks in the financial sector but hasn't been able to follow this example? And what are for you, maybe, do you see any opening or potential for positive change in the banking sector so that Triodos would not be just one of a kind, but become more of a model that others would follow?
Well, this is quite a fundamental question. I think we are all infected by a sort of market thinking, neoliberal thinking that if we work best for ourselves, it's in the benefit of the whole. And I think that's a complete misunderstanding. I think it's much better to work for the whole, and then you will benefit from it as well. So turning that around, what is not so easy, because it's something in education, in university, even when we get new co-workers, they completely think only markets can solve things. And markets are seen as the solution for everything, where I feel it's more markets can be very useful, but it's not the trick that will do it. The trick is that people start to have a different perception about how they can contribute to the well-being of other people. That should be the deeper motivation. And then markets can work sometimes and sometimes they don't. They need to be regulated. All those things have to happen. But the sort of belief, the ideology of markets will solve it all, I think is a very unacceptable methodology today. Maybe it was okay 50 or 100 years ago when there was plenty of planet and we could play with it, and we couldn't play with people, by the way. That has already changed, but we still do it. So we cannot play at the cost of others in markets. Markets should be really serving completely people and not the other way around. And I still hear a lot of conversations also in pension funds, in others, that they say, well, it's all very fine, this sustainability, but we need to make a return and we have to follow markets. I find that not an enough strong approach for today's issues.
And that's great that you're bringing that mindset element, because then we understand when we modelize indeed the system, we understand that there is a behavior that we can see, there is a culture and the mindset that is triggering that behavior, and that there is also the structure that is enabling and normalizing those behaviors and culture. How do you feel like, so we've mentioned already the behavior with the stakeholder governance itself and acting in the interest of all stakeholders. You've just mentioned the culture with this aspect of the mindset and understanding what type of, how do we call success? That's a collective success and not individual success, because then we can all benefit from it. And then that would trigger for more prosperity and equality for all of us. And if we go to the structure itself, what do you think could be the key enabler elements? So we know, and that's also part of this conversation and with Seri, that there are some consultations today that are being made at the EU level, various topics. So there is a conversation about extra non-financial reporting to understand what should be the norm in that sense, and how companies and businesses should disclose their impacts. There have been also now a new idea about due diligence and the scope of responsibility of companies at a global level and not only in this operating country. There have been also now talks about stakeholder governance, and that's also what we're trying to unlock, understand how should a company, should it be discretionary, should it be mandatory for a company to take into account and include their stakeholders. And I would be very curious to see, if we just stick to Triodos example, you've come to such a place without the structure following up. So you've built your way, made your way and built the path stone by stone. But do you feel that having a policy at the EU, like not even a country, but EU level, could maybe be one of the enabler to answer the other questions, to help accelerate the change in the financial sector and to have other companies leading? Or did you feel, or did at some point in the evolution of Triodos could feel that such a structural change could have maybe helped to accelerate the change that you're trying to bring?
Yeah, I think that is all about transition strategies. And I think some people feel it's only about the mindset and not about structure, and other people feel it's only structure and not the mindset. And of course it's both, and they go step by step. If you do too much on the one side, you will feel it's not filled with people who have a different mindset. If you're only thinking about mindset, you feel it's one by one and you don't really make enough progress. I think today we are at a point that some of the issues who have been dealt with by frontrunners, and I think I think the whole B Corp movement I see as the frontrunner movement, they show that it is possible. That's very important to get a strategy accepted. And now we are at a time where legislation has to come in to support the next group to make it really possible, because all the arguments not doing it are there. So it's not a level playing field, and if we do more social than others will not, so we can't do it either. That whole group, that middle group, I would say that is important to support them with legislation and getting a more advanced level playing ground, that they can really feel this is now the way society will go. And I think the first step in the EU are being taken. The taxonomy on green investments is an important. We have worked very hard with others on that to make that happen. So green is not a voluntary thing, but it's a real well-documented taxonomy where you can see it's green or greenwashing. So the definitions are quite important. And I think the same for governance forms. I think for the complexity of the questions of society today, you need a sort of third form of governance, what is not sort of the private ones of the big corporates today, where shareholder value is still the main thing. Whereas also not just family business, value-based businesses who are relatively sort of still kept in families and they do their work, but there is a sort of middle group what needs the support of governance, new governance on a European level, that they feel this can really help us to make this integrated stakeholder approach work. And that's also the work of Jaap Winter, who feeling, well, it is in the governance code, for example, of the Netherlands, that you should look at a broader interest. But what he wants is to go one step further and say it has to be in the law as well, makes it one step stronger. So I feel this, what I would call the codification of what has been prepared by the frontrunners, like B-Lab companies, now is very much the situation where we are in, and we should support it, and we should really make it work. And we are probably the examples as B Corps and Triodos more in the financial sector then, that it can work and that you can base a company on those principles.
That's a very powerful message. Thank you for leading that. Because indeed, without those front runners, as you call yourself, this would not have been made possible. And this momentum is quite exceptional to see all those different elements coming together, converging at some point. So we feel that there is now something to do and to act on any type of level so that we can get to that leveraging point where it becomes a norm. And this type of, as you said, collective success and stakeholder governance behavior but also the structure itself would come together and make it easier to behave in that way, because it would become normal and not just indeed being a front runner. I'm sure Triodos would still be leading in a certain way by, again, example, and innovating by showing how to indeed manage those stakeholders, because as you just mentioned before, and I will just end also with that very last question that I can see in the chat to make sure that we have answered all your questions before we wrap up this short conversation. It's not easy to manage the interest of all those different stakeholders, and maybe just if you had any advice on how any other company can start considering the interest of all stakeholders, and especially understand what are the key success factor to manage the conflicting interests that could be between the different stakeholders, which I can already guess that there is no like general rule, because there are like so many case-to-case basis. And but if you had just some tips for those companies that are maybe getting a bit scared to understand this complexity that they would bring, and like people not agreeing together, or those different conflicting interests, any advice or reassuring words for them to still jump in that?
Well, I think my advice would be, do not talk too much about shareholder interest or stakeholder interest, but stakeholder dialogue. I think many people completely understand that only their interests, serving their interests, that's their starting point. That's how they are educated. But if you turn it around and say, but it is about a stakeholder dialogue. So listen to your other stakeholders, not just to the company, but your other stakeholders. Then I think you will solve 80%, maybe 90% of all the conflicting interests, because suddenly if you see this other person, this other group, you get a different perspective on what you're interested in. So that is fundamental, that you make it go away from the company stakeholder dual discussion to a more group dialogue. I think that's very important. The other thing is for movement as B Corp, and I think B Corp is doing it, and Triodos as well, that we move away from the niche market approach to the front runner role. I mentioned it very many times in the bank. We are now a front runner, not a niche player anymore. If you're a niche player, you isolate yourself in a way in the bigger change, for the bigger changes. But at the same time, be very clear at the same time about what your principles are. So be a front runner with your principles. Do not start to compromise with, well, actually, the way hedge funds works for company, there are some good things as well. And you know, all these arguments where in the end you feel, what is really changing now? I think we have to have a quite clear refer to a moral compass everybody has on what business is about and what business should serve. And sometimes that conflicts also with bigger interests. We should not underestimate the bigger interests, but go for the principles, be open, and be a front runner with those principles. I think that's the best contribution you can give. And on the other side, I think the regulators and the governments will really support that more and more, because they feel this is what people actually want. And therefore we can really be in good examples for them. They're always asking for examples to make that change work, and they can help with the next group, supporting them with regulation to go a little bit more in that direction.
Thank you so much for so many insights. I feel like people will have to watch it again and again to incorporate all those aspects. And I really like how you always go back to that idea of a mindset and the positioning, which is not just a matter of process. It's not just about like getting people together. It's also about how you bring them together and how you position them in that dialogue. And I think that is something that is often underestimated, because we just rush into the mean, but without understanding the approach and how we are all connected in the relationship between those different stakeholders. And I do hope that many that are listening to us would follow also the advice of being front runners themselves, defining their authenticity and transparent principles, and keep hold of that, because indeed the change is happening. We have seen already many examples, and we hope that this can encourage more and more people to behave in that way. Maybe also just to end, in one of the recent podcasts I've been listening to, I'm trying to understand the different philosophy of implement change in general and happiness over the year in history. And one of the last podcasts I was listening to was about the theory of Aristotle, the Greek philosopher, and understanding that the best way to make a change and to become a better version of ourselves was to get started and to already think of ourselves in that better version, to be the change. And then, because this will bring positive outcomes, then we get encouraged and motivated to keep on going. So it's always that first step that is more complicated, because we go from point A to B, but by already putting ourselves in the mindsets and believing that we're already in that B position, then we see the benefits of it and we keep on going. So I do hope that many of you listening to this conversation will follow the advice of Peter and already behave and invite this stakeholder dialogue, so you can see already the benefits of behaving in this way for collective success. And I will end the conversation on that note by thanking everyone, and especially Peter, for sharing that coffee and tea for me conversation together, and to let everyone know that we will have another conversation coming up next week. The next episode will be with Christopher Emmanuel, which is the founder and CEO of Organic Basics, which is another great B Corps, but he will most specifically talk about how they engage their employees at the core of their business. And another big announcement, of course, is that in June 30th, we will be launching our Interdependence Coalition. We will receive, of course, an invitation to join us, and we hope that many of you will be coming there, because we want to gather all the different stakeholders in the dialogue, the same way we always behave in a systemic way, so that we can come up stronger to make those voices being heard, and that more and more people would get to understand what does it mean for stakeholder governance and all the different mechanisms for that to be taken in the decisions. Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you everyone for enjoying, and wishing you all a nice day.